To the European aristocrat, the United States was not a rising power. It was a grand, messy, and ultimately doomed experiment in mob rule. They looked across the Atlantic and saw a land without history, and most importantly, without the stabilizing hand of a titled nobility. To them, the Americans were a people of coarse manners and loud voices, a nation of clerks and farmers who had forgotten their place in the natural order of the world. They expected that, without the refined guidance of kings and dukes, this fragile republic would soon tear itself apart under the weight of its own vulgarity. Yet, a strange anxiety began to seep through the mahogany doors of the Old World. Despite the perceived barbarism of the Americans, the ships leaving Liverpool and Hamburg were overflowing. Thousands upon thousands of peasants and laborers were choosing the uncertainty of the American wilderness over the civilized certainty of their ancestral homes. This contradiction piqued the curiosity of the elite. A wave of European observers, counts, viscounts, and famous men of letters, decided to cross the ocean to document the disaster firsthand. They brought their journals, their silk waistcoats, and their deep-seated prejudices, ready to write home about the failures of the New World. But as they stepped off the docks in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, they were met with a reality that didn't just surprise them, it threatened the very core of their identity. The first blow to the aristocratic ego was not the architecture, but the atmosphere of the streets. In London or Vienna, a man's status was written in the way people moved around him. The lower classes practiced a choreography of deference, the tipping of the hat, the averted gaze, the stepping off the sidewalk to let a gentleman pass. But in America, that choreography was broken. Take the account of Frances Trollope, a British writer who arrived in 1827 with the intent of making her fortune and observing what she considered a pioneer society. In her scathing yet revealing work, Domestic Manners of the Americans, she expressed a visceral horror at the lack of social boundaries. She was appalled to find that her domestic servants insisted on eating at the same table as her family. To her, this wasn't just a breach of etiquette, it was a subversion of the divine order. She wrote with a shudder of the total and universal want of manners, even of the most common kind, noting that even the wealthiest Americans seemed to lack the polish of a third-rate European merchant. But beneath her insults lay a startling observation. These unmannerly people were remarkably comfortable. She saw a population that refused to be servile because they had no reason to be. The American worker didn't believe he was made of different clay than the aristocrat, and for a class that defined its worth by its superiority over others, this was a psychological earthquake. As these visitors moved inland, their confusion turned into a staggering realization of material abundance. One of the most recurring and shocking observations in their diaries concerned the American dinner table. In the 1840s, a rural laborer in England or a peasant in France lived on a repetitive, meager diet. Meat was a luxury, a celebratory treat seen perhaps once a week, if at all. But in America, the visitors found something they could hardly process, the triple meat standard. British parliamentary investigations into emigration recorded with disbelief the letters sent back home from humble laborers. One such letter stated simply, "I have 3 meat meals a day, whereas in England I had but 1 such meal a week." To the European mind, this was a violation of the biological order. If a common blacksmith in Ohio could eat like a duke in Sussex, the physical distinction between the classes was being erased. The Americans were taller, broader, and healthier than their European cousins. Alexis de Tocqueville, the French aristocrat who came to study American prisons but ended up studying the American soul, noted this with a mixture of admiration and dread. He saw that in America, the passion for physical well-being was the national religion. He observed that while the European peasant was resigned to his poverty, the American laborer was obsessed with his own improvement. Tocqueville realized that the American didn't just want to survive, he wanted to accumulate, and the system actually allowed him to do it. The shock deepened when the visitors looked at the land itself. In Europe, land was a fixed ancestral fortress. It was held by the few and guarded by centuries of law and tradition. A peasant was born on the land, died on the land, but never owned the land. But in the American West, the aristocrats saw a world where land was treated like a commodity rather than a sacred relic. They watched in horror and fascination as former servants from their own villages Men who would have been lucky to own a garden plot in Prussia now commanded hundreds of acres of black, fertile soil. Charles Dickens, during his 1842 tour, was often critical of American coarseness and the squalid nature of the frontier. Yet, even he could not deny the raw energy of the people. He wrote about the unsettled, restless, and ambitious spirit of the inhabitants. He saw men who had started with nothing, building towns in the wilderness with a speed that made European urban development look glacial. These men weren't just surviving, they were building empires. They weren't serfs, they were sovereigns of their own domain. The visitors tried to dismiss this as crass materialism, but they couldn't hide the truth. The American system was providing a level of dignity and autonomy that the aristocratic model had denied the common man for 1,000 years. The psychological discomfort of these aristocratic visitors reached its peak when they encountered the American political system. In Europe, power was a descent. It flowed from the crown down to the people. In America, it was an ascent. They were baffled by the lack of great men in the European sense. They looked for commanders and found instead lawyers and self-made merchants. They looked for a ruling class and found a mob that read newspapers and debated constitutional law. This was the era of Jacksonian democracy, where the common man was not just a participant, but the master of the state. European observers like Captain Basil Hall wrote with a sense of dizzying confusion about the total absence of all those barriers, which in Europe kept the different classes of society apart. He complained that the Americans were so incessantly occupied with their own greatness that they had no time for the refined silence of the old world. What Hall and others were witnessing was the birth of a new kind of human being, the self-made man. This concept was entirely foreign to a society where your worth was determined by who your grandfather was. In America, your worth was determined by what you could do with an axe, a plow, or a pen. By the 1850s, as the shadow of the Civil War began to loom, the aristocratic perception of America shifted from amused contempt to genuine fear. They saw the rise of a man who would become the ultimate symbol of their obsolescence, Abraham Lincoln. To the sophisticated salons of London, Lincoln was the final proof of American absurdity. He was a man of the frontier, a rail splitter with oversized hands and a high, weathered voice. He had no lineage, no classical education, and no royal favor. To a British lord, the idea of Lincoln leading a nation was as ridiculous as a stable boy being crowned king. They called him a peasant, a buffoon, and a barbarian. They predicted that under such low-born leadership, the American experiment would finally shatter. But as the crisis deepened, the very things they mocked, his ruggedness, his lack of pretension, his connection to the common soil, became his greatest strengths. The aristocrats failed to see that Lincoln wasn't an anomaly. He was the logical conclusion of the American system. He was the man who had eaten the 3 meat meals, who had cleared the cheap land, and who had used the high wages of a free society to buy the books that taught him how to lead. The visitors who arrived in the decade before the war were witness to a civilization that was outperforming their own in every material metric. They saw a railway system that was expanding faster than anything in Europe. They saw an industrial capacity in the north that was beginning to dwarf the great centers of Manchester and Lyon. Yet, they clung to their prejudice. They argued that American wealth was accidental, a product of too much land and too few people. They refused to admit that it was the product of a different social architecture. They ignored the fact that while Europe spent its energy maintaining the walls of class, America was spending its energy tearing them down. The travelers who returned to Europe in the late 1850s were different men. Their journals were no longer filled with jokes about American spittoons and coarse language. Instead, they were filled with a quiet, somber respect and a growing sense of dread. They realized that the American experiment hadn't failed. It had succeeded so well that it was now exporting its values back across the Atlantic through every letter sent by an immigrant to his family in the old country. In the end, the aristocrats realized that they hadn't visited a zoologico of savages, but a mirror of their own future. They saw a world where a man was defined by his work rather than his bloodline, where a full stomach was a right rather than a privilege, and where the vulgar energy of the masses was more powerful than the refined traditions of the few. They saw that the American worker, with his higher wages and his meat-heavy diet, was becoming a new kind of citizen, one who would eventually demand the same rights and the same dignity back in Europe. The age of the aristocrat was over, and the age of the citizen had begun. The sun was setting on the palaces of Europe, and it was rising over the prairies of a nation that had dared to believe that no man was born with spurs on his heels, and no man was born with a saddle on his back. The aristocrats saw their world ending in the prosperity of the American commoner, and they knew, deep down, that they were the ones who had been truly inferior all along. They had come to judge, but they stayed to witness the birth of the modern world, a world that had no need for kings,